Dr. Marshall Benton Taylor, Henry Adams, Calvin Fleming, and his brother Samuel Henan would all be indicted as suspects in the Killing Rock Massacre on June 3, 1892. After a shootout, which occurred on July 17th, the four men would go into hiding, and for the first time in the story would be described as, quote, men on the run, unquote. Dr. Taylor would eventually make his way to Bluefield, West Virginia, and be apprehended by the Baldwin Detective Agency. The apprehension would take place on a southbound train in Pearisburg, Virginia, on or about the 20th of July. Dr. Taylor would then be returned to Wise County to stand trial on the 26th. But when he appeared in court on August the 2nd, the indictment against him was quickly quashed and thrown out of court. The oft-told tale tells us that this was for an unknown reason, and that the original indictment against him had been lost. But this isn't exactly true. In his book, Charles Johnson asserts in the 22nd chapter of his book that Dr. Taylor's defense moved to have an indictment thrown out because one of the original grand jurists owned a gristmill. At that time, Virginia law forbid industrialists from serving on juries. This matter was placed before a jury which returned a verdict signed by the jury foreman, J. M. Hamilton. The returned verdict stated that J. W. Stewart was not the owner or proprietor of a gristmill, and the effort by the defense was squashed. Then the defense moved to have the indictment thrown out, and the motion was sustained, and the indictment was quashed for an unknown reason and thrown out of court. Charles Johnson maintains that no one alive remembers the reason. However, thanks to digitalization efforts made over the last 10 years, we now know why the original indictment was thrown out, and it had to do with jury foreman Hamilton. After the jury returned the verdict on the issue of J. W. Stewart, and the defense filed a second protest stating that J. M. Hamilton was a journalist and that he had served on the grand jury at an earlier date that year. We know this because we were able to find a digital copy of the writ of protest made by Dr. Taylor's defense team. The protest was written in pencil, but the notes made on it by the county court clerk was written in ink. The clerk notes and the second objection was dropped. The only reason that such a protest would be withdrawn is if the original indictment was thrown out. A withdrawal of this type allowed the court to proceed. Charles Johnson and the oft-told tale seems to collaborate that the original indictment was lost. But when examining Mr. Johnson's book, he dictates an indictment with a 2-count charge. We are also told that the new indictment was, quote, handwritten, unquote. We found a copy of the original indictment. It turns out that Mr. Johnson gives us an indictment with the wrong date. As it turns out, in 1892, a new grand jury was appointed on the 26th of each month, and it just so happened that on the 26th of July occurred on a Tuesday, just as it did in May. Mr. Johnson is correct. There is a missing indictment, but the indictment that is now missing but recorded by him is the handwritten second indictment. So why the mix-up? What's going on in Johnson's book and the oft-told tale? The original indictment charged that Dr. Marshall Benton Taylor had lain in ambush in a rock pile that lay near a roadside of which was then known as Pound Mount Sterling Road. It went on to charge that about 1 p.m. he and his compatriots attacked and killed the Mullins party. In Dot Taylor's indictment, the charge stated that the attack was carried out using a certain gun. Here lies the problem with this indictment, which is corrected in the second indictment written by Robert Bruce. When he had been apprehended, Dot Taylor had in his possession his 2 Colt .45 pistols. These pistols had been entered as evidence against Taylor. When the new indictment was written, the only difference between the two indictments is that the new handwritten indictment says that Taylor had used his pistols. But there is a further problem with the second indictment that did not appear until the September trial. Dr. Marshall B. Taylor owned a pair of Colt .45s, which are a center fire weapon. The shell casings, which are found at the crime scene in a quote, neat little pile, unquote, were by this time thought to have been carelessly discarded when someone had reloaded a pistol. However, those shell casings were from a rim-fired weapon. We will have more about this in the Killing Rock Untold story about Doc's gun. After Commonwealth Attorney Robert Bruce obtained a new indictment for the July 26 grand jury, Dr. Taylor's defense moved to have the trial moved to a circuit court, and the trial date was set for September the 5th. It is our belief that Taylor's defense made a grave error in doing this. We will also cover this in the Untold story. Dr. Taylor would be found guilty by a jury in the September trial, but not on the testimony of Jane Mullins. During the trial, Jane was hammered by the defense over her 4-hour absence immediately following the massacre. She would face testimony from friends and family over a multitude of contradicting statements that she had made to them. In the end, Jane would break under the questioning and admit that she was a liar, thus perjuring herself. Ultimately, Doc Taylor would be found guilty based on the circumstantial evidence of the shell casings found at the crime scene and his rifle. We think that when Charles Johnson was doing the research for his book, he never saw the handwritten indictment. Instead, we believe that the court clerk prepared a copy for him combining both indictments and telling him that the original was lost. The reason for this could have been an attempt to cover for what occurred in the trial with Doc's gun. This concludes the Killing Rock the Untold Tales series. We would like to thank you for watching this presentation. While there are subjects that we have not touched upon in this series, such as the trial, the appeal, and the hanging, we feel that the topics deserve an in-depth investigation for the past 130 years. These events have been oversimplified in the telling. These and other topics will be covered in our next series, The Killing Rock the Untold Story. We thank you for continuing to support Kentucky Tennessee Living as we bring to you the history of the Appalachian Mountains. We remind everyone that the story names of Killing Rock, The Untold Tales, and Killing Rock, The Untold Story are both under Kentucky Tennessee Living copyright.